Well, now that Lee has got the config system behind us, it's time to take a look at something else, and that is the FPS counter. Correctly?
Yep, we're gonna put together a little FPS counter. It's gonna be interesting because there's some things that it's gonna report that aren't going to be exactly the same as what we see through a couple of other Unity indicators of what the frames per second is doing. So
Any
when
any
we
idea why we're going to get different numbers?
just because they're sampling at different rates, and nobody on Unity's forums has really figured out the perfect way to figure out the exact frame per second count. So when we get to displaying the FPS on the screen,
Mm-hmm.
I'll show you what it's reporting. I'll show you also what the stat window is showing, and we've got Unity, or Unity Pro, so we'll be able to also go into the profiler and look at the number that it's reporting. And then you'll see that every single one of them is reporting something different. And then when we build out to a standalone, we'll see something different yet again.
Okay.
So this is just one way of getting a counter, but as to which is the most accurate, there's a lot of debate. So, but let's get started with just the simple counter itself. What we're going to do is we're going to implement this as another framework feature. So inside of features, I'm going to add another class. So this class will be called FPS counter. And I can get rid of all of this, but I'm going to need the Unity engine. Go ahead and clean up the namespace. And we're going to make this a public static class, because I don't need more than one. Inside of here, we're going to need several fields to keep track of what's going on, as well as a couple of properties so we can access the information that this is calculating. So let's start off with a private static float. We'll call it elapsed time. This is going to keep track of the amount of time that has elapsed from the last time the frames per second were calculated. The next field that we're going to keep track of is going to be an integer. This is the frames. So this is the number of frames that have been displayed since the last update. We'll have another static float. This will be our time left. And we're going to decrement this as time progresses. We're going to count down our time left before we do our next calculation. Our properties are going, again, to be static. We're going to have a string that is called FPS. Give it our getter and setter. This will return our frames per second as a string to be displayed, so we don't have to do any formatting. It'll be pre-formatted for us. Going to have another property that is going to be our update interval. So this will be a way that we can customize how often our counter updates. Not so much it's always going to be calculated, but how often are we going to determine that calculation. So instead of running it continuously, we're going to have an interval that we're going to default to every half second. So twice a second, we will calculate out the frame per second. And I'll show how that works here in a little bit. Now, we need two methods to make this work. We're going to have our start method, which is going to get everything ready to go. And then we're going to have our update method. And this one will be called update. And this is what will get run every frame. Now, as far as start, what we need to do to get things going is set our update interval to default to 0.5, so every half second. And our time left is going to be equal to our update interval. So this is going to get things kicked off. And I'm going to put another static up here. Let's do a private static bool is initialized. I can spell really. For some reason, I can't remember how to spell it.
T.
Yeah.
There you go.
My brain froze for a sec. So, see, I can't spell. Is initialized. And then at the very end of our start, we'll say is initialized. That should be. So I'm going to go fix this up here. Is initialized. So instead of having a specific function called initialize, I'm just going to rely on start. So in update, what we'll do is go if not is initialized, then go ahead and run start. So this gives us the ability, we can either force start, or if we just forget to call start the very first time update gets called, start will be called first.
Who's going to call start?
Right now, it'll be update if we don't manually call start.
I didn't know if you had another place that you wanted to call
well,
start.
Because we could. The way that features are handled is inside of Game Manager. We would call start here. But the way I'm setting this up is in case we didn't want to call start here.
Okay.
If for some reason somebody goes, oh, hey, I've got an FPS counter, and FPS counter's got update, and then they just go with that. This is just a method to make sure that our FPS counter is properly set up before that happens. So if you wanted to follow the convention that we're setting forth with everything else, then you definitely would go in and say FPS counter dot start, and then in update you would have here. This it's just a fail-safe in case somebody forgets to put this part in.
Okay.
So now we've got some kind of counting or time counting that we need to do. We need to decrement our time left, and that's going to be our time dot delta time. So the amount of time from last frame we're going to subtract from our time left. We're going to take our elapsed time, and we're going to increment it by our time scale divided by our time delta time. Now we're doing this because it is possible inside of Unity to apply a scale to your timeline. So this will ensure that if your scale is at anything other than 1, it's being calculated in your elapsed time. And then we're going to increment our frames. So you could do it either way. In this case, you could do the plus frames or frames plus, depends on what you want to do. So if you want to do it that way, you could as well. Now, the next part is we're going to check to see if time left is less than or equal to 0. So if time left has gone below 0, then it's time to update our FPS, or our frame per second information. So we'll go var FPS equals elapsed time divided by our frames cast to a float. And then we'll take our output. So we'll make another variable called output, and we're going to set this to be a string.format. And inside of this, we're going to go with 0. And we want to set a 2 digits on the decimal place, and then put FPS at the end of it. Subtract that by what we've calculated our FPS to be. Hit semicolon, wait for the lag to catch up. And then we're going to set our property FPS to equal our output string, so our output. Go ahead and take our time left, reset it to be equal to our update interval, take elapsed time, set it back to 0, take our frames, and reset that to 0. So that will calculate out our frame per second. Now this frame per second is going to be based off the number of times this update gets called inside of our game manager. So this information is going to be completely reliant on how many times this method gets called. This is not the case necessarily with the amount that the other methods of which Unity measures the frame per second. So if I wanted to, let's say, go ahead just for now, let's build this out, make sure there's no errors. If I were to go over here inside of our project, create a new GUI text.
Are you in? Wait. Are you in
Oh,
yours?
yeah, how did I do that?
I don't know. There you go.
I did a good job. Here we go. Let's try yours. Create other GUI text. And let's go ahead and rename this debug text. Make sure I spelled that right. Okay, good. So now go ahead and delete. Well, let's put that here for now. And we'll leave it right in the center. So go ahead and erase that out. Go back into our code and say ignore. And just for sake of argument for right now, inside of here, I'm going to change this, but I'm just putting it here for now, is come on, and create a new game object. We'll call this debug text. Inside of here, debug text is going to be equal to game object dot find debug text, and then after the update we'll just say debug text dot GUI text dot text equals our FPS counter dot FPS. So if we hit that, we go back to Unity and we hit play, Give it a sec.
There you are.
All right. So now, right, about twice a second, I'm getting some lag, but we can see we've got 2 decimal places of precision on our frames, but it's bouncing between, looks like about 70 and about 120.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we switch over and look at the stats, we see something different. So this is saying 140, 172, 134. Well, this is still saying 86. So these numbers are different. If I go into, let me hide that so I can see window. If I go into the profiler and I look at this frame per second, we get something completely different. And everybody's probably wondering, well, this is almost 1,000 frames per second. That's awesome. And up here, it says 4,000 frames per second. And up here, it says 1,000. So we've got one number here, 10,000 frames per second here, and about 1,682. This is what I'm saying. This is very complicated. And nobody seems to have a really good answer of why everything is different. I do know that this is sampling from inside of Unity's engine in one way. And I'm not sure what they're sensing. I know this is different than this one. The only one that I know for sure is this is considering how many draw calls are being called a second, not updates per second. And this is being calculated by the number of updates per second. So I know why these two are different. I know that the profiler uses different sampling locations, but I don't know which ones they are. There's no real documentation on saying this is exactly what the profiler is timing. It's just reporting something different. Now, some of the forums that you find inside of Unity says this is the closest as far as if you're trying to figure out how many frames are being drawn per second. But if you want to get an accurate understanding of what your game is doing, then this method is actually counting the real updates that are happening per second. So if you had some AI stuff, some game logic that was going on, this number that we're calculating is the number of times that that logic is being calculated, because these updates are different from the number of frames or draws that are actually being sent to the GPU.
Right.
That's the best I can figure out from everything I've read. Now, something I've tried desperately to figure out, and I haven't found a way yet, is you would think that, okay, this is being calculated somewhere. We should be able to ask Unity for this number and display it. I have not to this date found a way to do that. So as far as I know, currently there is no way to get this number out and then displayed inside of our display. So this is about the closest that I can get between the two so far. Now, I'm trying to think anything else that we can show. We can show something else. Right now, inside the editor, you can see that we're running at about 70 to 120. We can also, is this on your screen? You see the build settings?
Yeah, it's on my screen.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure it was your build settings and not mine. So if we do build and run, if I do train demo, and go ahead and run that. So now when we're running inside of a window, we get a whole different number.
Yeah, much much different now with the resolution and all of
Right.
that stuff as well.
So if we go through and we're capturing, and
Right.
so
That puts a heavy burden on the
right,
system.
and usually standalone will run faster. So then it does in the editor, and in this case, we're running faster inside the editor. Something else, if you're not getting the numbers that you think you should be getting, one of the things that you can look at is under your quality settings. Right now we're using good settings. Sync to VBL, basically whether or not we're using vertical sync. So if we change that and we build out again, and let's go ahead and make this a little bit smaller. So now without vertical sync on, we get some really fast numbers. But what I wanted to point out is our FPS counter is at best an approximation of the frame rate. We're not, to this point, I've not found an accurate way of saying, okay, this is the absolute frame rate that we're running at. So not in the editor, not in the profiler, not from any counter that, or any counter script that I found on the Unity site. I mean, the from the Unity wiki is the code that I derived my FPS counter from, and even that is not completely accurate. So what this does do is it gives you an indicator that you can use to figure out, okay, I've made this change and I'm running slower or faster than I was last time. That's about the best that you're going to be able to get with any of these FPS counters, is a comparison of changes that you've made. So if you've made this change or you've made that change, and then you compare it with what your counters were saying either before or after the changes, and use it that way as opposed to going, yeah, my editor says I got 500 frames a second. That's not necessarily true. So
Okay. Well, does that wrap everything up that you wanted to cover in this video?
for this one, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, everyone.